God rational? Just kind of refine that and kind of think about some questions around that. But go ahead, Nick.
All right. I'll put out an argument that belief in God is not rational. If you guys are interested in hearing it, I assume everyone here is familiar with the Kalam cosmological argument, right?
Say that one more time.
Is everyone here familiar with the Kalam cosmological argument?
No.
Yes.
Sorry.
Okay. Basically,
yes, sure.
I'll start from scratch. Don't worry about what I just said. Scientists and philosophers are convinced of the premise that an infinite regress of events cannot exist. And what they mean by that is that time cannot extend to the past eternally, or you would never get to the present. The existence has to have had a hard beginning. A way of thinking about this is if your bank account was at the balance negative infinity, then you can never put enough money in it in order to clear your balance. And so, again, when they say that an infinite regress of events cannot exist, they're saying that nothing can have an infinitely existing or an eternal past. But God is an eternally existing figure. God has an eternal past. You have to deal with an infinite set of events leading up to the moment in which He creates the universe. Because of that, and the premise that an infinite regressive events cannot exist, you therefore are stuck with having to eliminate God because it doesn't make sense as a hypothesis. It has a major reductio ad absurdum. Therefore, theism is irrational.
Okay. Wow. Did you just accept the Kalam cosmological argument as valid and then apply it to God?
I've been convinced
what about the universe?
Infinite regressive events on a while. Yeah.
Huh?
This is the same argument I used against William Lane Craig if you'd watched my video already.
I'll watch it at some point. So, in any case, I feel like, here's how I feel. It doesn't really take into account the idea that two things. One, I think there's a lot of math problems in the suggestion that that an infinite past means we could never have reached this point. It sounds kind of Zeno's paradoxy. And for those who don't know who Zeno was, he argued that because it's an infinite number of units from here to here, from here to here is half that distance, half that distance, half that distance. It's an infinite number of units, therefore movement is impossible. And that was Zeno's paradox, and it's dumb. But
but you still have two firm start and ends though.
No, but if you have a timeline where time is moving forward independently of whether there's an infinite in both directions, like if there is a now, which there would be a now, like no matter how long it stretched in either direction, then you can have something in that now. That said, the bigger problem here is, Nick, you didn't take into account the fact that most theists would say a phrase like God exists outside of time and mean something by it, and they'd mean different things. Some would say He exists in a different timeline, which interacts with ours in a strange way. Some would say that God is like, if the timeline is like the bottom of this screen here, and God is overlaid on it like a static structure, such that as we move along it, and we see God appearing to act and move, it's really more like coming up on a turn in the road. And it seems from our perspective like the road has changed, but the road has always been there, we've just hit a different part of it. That's another way to address this problem. And I feel like you've kind of dismissed the entire outside of time perspective and accepted the cosmological argument in kind of a weird way, because now the universe and God can't exist due to bad math. So that's how I feel about that.
Okay, to respond, the first thing you said was the Zeno's Paradise was kind of building up to this, but I'm going to just start, unless you'd like for me to hit on the earlier stuff, I'm going to start with one of the possibilities is that God exists in His own timeline and interacts with ours in a strange way. Is that okay?
Yeah, please.
Okay, first you are completely unable to define this strange relationship, but even if God exists on His own timeline, you can still not have an infinite regress of events. The premise doesn't apply to our specific time. It's a philosophical conjecture of just time in general. Now, while the physical time might have empirical backing, for example, through the second law of thermodynamics, that's something that gets disputed a bit in science. But we're looking at the philosophical argument, and I already gave what that is through my bank analogy. And so even if God's on his own, this isn't our time, like this isn't the 13 billion year long universe, but instead let my pencil represent God himself. Say he creates the universe right here, you still have this infinite line stretching out until that happens. You have to surpass an eternal past in order to get to that moment. Another one you mentioned, why did I just sit down my notes like an idiot? Hold on.
Can you make your pencil rubber?
I wish. Why did I just close my notes? That was stupid of me. Hold on. Okay, and then you said something called outside time, which you didn't really define, but I'm going to refute the notion that we shouldn't think of God as timeless. And that's because if God cannot act in temporality, then he cannot make any decisions. Everything has to be one weird simultaneous instance. Then allow me to elaborate on that. In order for God to decide on something, hey, I'm going to create mankind. Now I'm going to come down as Jesus. You have temporality. You have one event prior to the other, so therefore there's a chronological sequence, therefore time. And the idea that God is timeless, in one instant singularity, God creates the universe, creates mankind, punishes them through the different punishments in the Old Testament, then comes down as Jesus, and at the same time gets crucified as Jesus, and at the same time gets resurrected as Jesus, and at the same time comes down for the second coming of Jesus. And that's just complete nonsense and several violations of the law of non-contradiction. But furthermore, even if something is completely unchanging and has absolutely zero events occurring to the eye, there's still time passing by. The state of affairs can be completely 100% identical going from frame of existence to frame of existence, but there still has to be a chronological succession. And even if x equals x, then x can still exist twice. And so you might say it might be absurd to talk about, it's been about 5 seconds ago since. You can't define when 5 seconds ago was because there's nothing relative to compare it to, but that's a problem on the observer from our perspective, and it's an argument from ignorance to talk about how we can't actually define the amount of time that has passed. And to finally give one final mathematical proof of my argument, if we can define it, let's say there's one distinguishing event. For example, God creates the universe, so now it makes logical sense to talk about the time before he created the universe and the time after. Basically, you can talk about units of time as to be divided to things we can relate them to. So premise P divided by 1, you have one dividing event, the creation of the universe, leads to 2 separate amounts of times. However, and obviously this increases more, but if you're going to say that there's no changing events to distinguish anything, then you have your premise divided by 0 equals an infinite amount of events, so you're still stuck with an infinite amount of events to pass by until the creation of the universe.
Okay, so here's what I want to say, a few things. First, I want to point out that you commented at a lot of things that I left undefined and vague. I want to point out that this is not me making an argument for God's existence and you rebutting it. This is you making an argument for why God's existence is irrational and me rebutting it.
Right.
Okay, so I have a few things I want to say. First, you appeared to I guess I'll address that one last, actually. First, you addressed the fact that one of 2 possible definitions for outside of time was that God exists in his own timeline. And then you talked to me about being unable to define what that would look like. I have no idea what that would look like. I've never experienced time in any way other than this one. But as long as we agree that it's possible to experience time in a different way than this one, which makes sense, because according to relativity, we aren't even experiencing time the same as one another. So the idea that God would experience it in a way that's at all like what we see seems a little absurd. But I agree that it's not definable. I just wanted to make that point, that there is a possible escape route through the mysterious ways timeline about which we know nothing and can make no arguments. But Instead of that, what I want to talk about is the idea of a structure overlaid on the timeline, as I discussed the second option, and which you kind of railed against for a while. If God's omniscient in the sense that he can know everything about the past and everything about the future, then it seems strange to define him as a being that has a now. And when you talk about how he couldn't react to things, it would be like if I dropped a wet towel on the ground, like it would mold itself around the rocks and such, just as God would mold himself around the actions that we take in the timeline. And things that we perceive as God acting or making decisions in the sense that you're describing might actually be God's unchanging structure responding to the timeline that he's on top of. Does that make sense? I mean, do you understand what I'm saying? Not do you think?
Right. Yeah. No, I understand you.
Okay. Good. So not only does that seem possible to me, but the fact that God is omniscient in that sense, or rather, the fact that the assertion is that God is omniscient in that sense in most cases kind of seems like it makes it the most likely option, and it kind of hurts a lot of the stuff that you're saying. But back to the infinite regression. This entire argument is based on the idea that it is impossible for things to infinitely regress, which kind of yeah, like I said in the last thing, I have a pretty big problem with that. I don't see any reason why an infinite regression is impossible. It seems to me that if there is an infinite regression of time going backwards and an infinite regression of steps, then at any given now, something is happening, which means it was possible to reach that now. Which means we're accepting as a premise that nows exist in the timeline that we've been able to reach in spite of the infinite regression. So the argument that this now couldn't have happened because of an infinite number of steps before us seems to me like it's an assertion that there's something magically special about this now that wouldn't be true of whatever now we would be on if we were in an infinite regression of time. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yep, I'm completely with you so far.
Okay. From this point, my notes become a jumbled mess, so I'm going to assume that that's all I had to say.
Okay. And so I'm going to go ahead and start responding. If anyone else has a comment, feel free to jump in. But for now, you talked about the alternate timeline. Your first alternative was mysterious, and because it's mysterious, there might be something about it that we don't know that changes it. And well, you didn't really argue for this, and maybe there's something that we don't know, but you haven't actually given any evidence for that idea. And so therefore, that most evidence proposition is that an infinite regressive events cannot exist. And when talking about temporality, furthermore, I would argue that this is not just some sort of it's not like we look at our time again and determine based on some physics-related structure that we can't have an infinite regress. It's a philosophical problem for any timeline because you never get to the present. And that applies to another timeline. And the only way out of it, the mysterious way he would have had to have is to have not been eternal past. What sort of implication that might have if God has a beginning? I suppose that's one hell of another issue, but that's basically the rebuttal to the alternative timeline. As far as God being timeless, he said that God is omniscient and so therefore unchanging and reacts towards certain events simultaneously and molds himself around it, and it's simply our misinformed perspective that allows us to perceive God as kind of doing things in a temporality succession. But however, God created the universe from ex nihilo, and so this becomes immediately absurd because you're basically saying that in order for God to have reacted to and made the universe, you basically have God molding himself around the idea of himself creating something, and so you have God reacting to something that he has not yet created, and so therefore it cannot be simultaneous. There still has to be a moment of which God did not create the universe, followed by a moment in which he did create the universe. And to give one more argument that's independent of this, if God was eternally creating the universe, then our universe would be eternal. And so we would no longer be able to say that our universe started 13.7 billion years ago, because if God is unchangingly creating a universe, then infinitely our universe is created. And now to hit another point that you mentioned, you questioned whether or not an infinite regress is impossible, and you said this: if an infinite regress is in fact what's happening, then it is in fact possible because we are in the present and have reached the present. So, and that would contradict the premise. This is circular logic. You are assuming an infinite regress in order to reach an infinite regress. This is completely absurd. I have already disproven it's an infinite regress because you wouldn't be able to get to the present. In order to imply that you got to the present, you would have to have said you've reached enough time in order to hit infinite time, and that can't have happened. So the hypothetical that, well, an infinite regress of events has occurred immediately becomes 100% falsified. And by simply assuming the what if is that we wouldn't be having this conversation. And if you try and merge it, then you're violating the law of non-contradiction.
Okay, are you done?
Yeah.
Max,
Okay.
we'll have you respond real quick, and then we'll go on to the next
Okay, cool. I'll just say a few things, and then you guys can talk about whatever you want then. In the mysterious ways timeline, you pointed out that I didn't give evidence, but I don't have to give evidence because I'm just explaining why your argument isn't knocked down, not making my own argument.
No, you made your argument that he could cooperate with the premise that infinite regressive events cannot exist. You didn't make an argument for God's existence, but if you're going to counter my argument to say that he can,
I'm talking
then you
specifically.
are arguing for that.
I'm talking specifically about the alternate timeline interacting with our timeline in a way that we don't understand. Mysterious ways time idea, which is basically the concept that ultimately we can't disprove God because we have no idea what a being like that would do, or what other ways of time that there are to experience. But in regards to, and I'm going to say this, and then if you want to say the last word, that's fine, because I don't want to go back and forth with this all day. With regards to the infinite regress point, I just want to point out again, like you say that it's circular because I assumed an infinite regression in order to prove that it's possible. But from my perspective, it seems to me that if we assume as a premise that there is an infinite regression, if that can still lead to a possible world in which this now is existing, which is what I demonstrated when I explained that I did, then it kind of...
You didn't demonstrate that. You just said that if that happened, then that would have happened.
I don't understand, because it seems to me that if an infinite regression did exist, but time was still moving, then a present would exist at any given point in the timeline. It seems to me that if that's the case, then... I just don't understand how you can say that it's impossible to reach a premise.
The problem is that you're starting off with the premise that an infinity exists. That's where the problem lies. Mathematicians let me finish. Let mathematicians deny the existence of an actual infinity, and that's where the absurdity comes from. Yes, if we actually assume an infinity occurs, then we are able to circumvent the problem. But the problem isn't mounting off of the infinity; is that the infinity itself is completely absurd, and that's why it creates the problem. So you're not really solving the issue. You're creating your own problem, a straw man to solve. You're not solving the fact of the infinity itself, and that's why mathematicians of all sorts deny the existence of an actualized infinity.
We have theoretical situations in which a single place on an infinite bidirectional timeline happen all the time. That's what a Turing machine is.
Such as?
A Turing machine is the idea that it's a machine, a theoretical machine that can solve any computable problem with an infinite reel of tape on either side. Like, okay, but
I haven't heard of that one, so I can't really talk about it.
Okay, it's not a perfect analogy, but just gonna put the final word on this, and then you can have
let you have the final word. I'll close my notes.
Yeah, I'll say something, and then you say something, and then we'll let other people talk about stuff.
You conclude.
Okay. Oh, you're gonna let me conclude?
Yeah. I can't let you look that bad.
Oh, excuse me. Okay, we're gonna talk about this later. But here's what matters right now.
I love you, Max.
I see what you're saying in that if I started at one end of a tape, it's impossible to have a one end of the tape. So it's impossible to have a timeline at all. Is kind of what you're saying. But I feel like I feel like that problem is more theoretical than it is actually a mathematically provable thing, I guess. I feel like, I mean, we work with infinite in math all the time. I mean, I'm a math minor. I've taken endless numbers of upper-level math classes. And I guess I feel like the only obstacle to an infinite regression is the fact that it seems kind of difficult to imagine. And like, well, but our brain keeps wanting to say, okay, well, where does it start? But like from my perspective, it seems like it would be impossible to tell whether this universe is in an infinite regression or not. And I feel like you haven't really put out a solid proof as to why it couldn't be. But maybe I'm wrong. I'll rewatch this video and see if I'm wrong, but I don't think that I am.
Okay.
Because I'm never wrong.
Well, cool. Thank you. That was really cool. I enjoyed listening to that. Jordan, I wanted to go back to you.